the long-term significance of that change is that the products which we originally were assigned are no longer products that are central or vital to the development of capitalism. And note I said the products which we were assigned. In the Caribbean, we were assigned sugar. There was no choice. The Ghanaians had an assignment of cocoa. The International Division of Labor allocated to the Senegal and to Gambia and to the Gambia the role of providing groundnuts, or peanuts as we call it.
Hello everybody and welcome to the African Economic History Podcast. I'll be your host for this evening, Eric, and tonight we're diving into the whole thing, from the very beginning of the Stone Age, African economic history, all the way up to the year 1800. Let's get started. This podcast is fundamentally interested in the evolution of Africa's economy, and this is a word that we're going to be hearing a lot through the podcast because we're trying to focus on exactly how Africa's economies featured a genesis or an evolution from very humble beginnings up into the complex highs of especially 14th century and 15th century. And while we're going to be focusing on that evolution, we're also going to be focusing on a crescendo where African economic complexity in the various different economies that existed tapered upwards and upwards through ecstatic growth and innovation up into a crescendo, and then from that point things really start to decline and move downwards in often cases in economic complexity, but also in raw economic output. Now, how did that happen? Especially considering modern Africa is on a huge growth trend. We can look at Nigeria or Kenya and see that Africa is growing very quickly, but to understand the roots of that growth, we should get back to the first time that Africa grew in such a splendid way. And to do so, we have to begin right at the very beginning with the Stone Age. Walter Rodney, who we heard a brief snippet from in the intro to this podcast, tried to grapple with this fundamental question of the basis to an economy and what development is and sort of how to orient ourselves around these questions. And he basically describes development and the basis to an economy as being a person's ability to win their living from nature. Okay, so to be able to intervene in their environment and out of that to make a living. And the degree at which a person can do that on a personal level determines their economy and their development. And simultaneously, the way in which a society can do that determines their development and their economy. So if we can consider that as a sort of universal basis to this, then the first ability for people to be able to win their living from the environment begins in the African Stone Age, and it begins with stone and bone tools. Now, stone and bone tools are incredibly important because those are the tools in which people were able to extract their food from the environment. At first, it was just to be able to replicate themselves, but eventually, as these things got more complex and as tool usage got more complex, they could extract that much more. But this began with bone and stone fish hooks and bone and stone axes and bone and stone pickaxes and tools for farming, especially, and interested in gathering food. And so because Africa is the birthplace of humanity, this is the first time that humanity had really operated with tools at all. So what this does is this provides enough for a society and for a person to self-replicate. So they can continue into the next generation and they have enough for themselves. Economically, during this period of evolution, what this looks like is the increase of the human population and the spreading of the human population throughout the whole continent of Africa. This spreading of the population and its ability to grow, even marginally at this time, is really important because that performs as a bedrock for the rest of African history and African economies. So these economies at first were hunter-gatherer economies. They're interested in self-perpetuation, and they were fundamentally serving the economy by increasing the number of people available and the number of laborers. Drawing on Rodney's research, we can really see that a hugely important part of this expansion of basic agriculture was the advent of cereal crops. As people were able to take especially millet, but also wheat and barley into cultivation, that changed everything. Because instead of harvesting low-key, not very nutritious tubers or small vegetables that were wild, these domesticated plants like the cereal grains we described meant that you could have incredibly calorie dense, incredibly rich, incredibly nutritious food that would be able to be produced en masse. And this was a game changer because now agriculture was getting bigger than ever. Rodney describes the central, most important point of this period as being devising tools to lighten the load of labor, as well as to transform hostile environments into areas suitable for human activity. And the cultivation of cereal grains was a huge part of that. This new period also saw the domestication of sheep, goats, and cattle, and this was huge because the animals also evolved while they were domesticated. Not just the crops, which we managed to create from wild grasses that now are these incredibly calorie-dense foods like our cereals, but also with animals too. Sheep, for example, differed hugely from the Neolithic Age to the Stone Age. And you have an interesting thing going on whereby farming practices are shaped by the environment at first, but eventually human actions start to shape the crops and the animals being interacted with. So instead of this exclusively being a thing that we're discovering these wild plants and using them, rather our actions are now shaping wildlife and animals themselves. So if we're to look at African agriculture in this transitional phase, cereal crops like wheat, millet, and barley were, of course, important. But alongside the cereals were also yams, floated pumpkin, bananas, oil plants, or oil trees. These both come from palms, right? So oil palms and raffia palms as well. In areas like West Africa, high levels of rainfall and the forest terrain allowed for the extensive cultivation of palms. Now, because this is an agrarian economy, the focus on different plants and things like that, which might seem a little bit strange to a modern viewer in a modern industrial society, is really important because the different amounts of crops that can be produced produce hugely different economic results. So in an economy that's measured in pounds of wheat or in calories or something, changing a crop means a gigantic change in the amount of economic output. And so that's really the innovation that happens in this period, is that as these new crops are picked up and brought under cultivation, hugely different economic outcomes are now happening, specifically because of new nutrient-rich crops being brought under cultivation. So just that you're still with me, the evolution that we're seeing is in the agricultural base to society and to the economy. As that agricultural base changes in what crops are being produced or what animals are being harvested, that massively changes the economy. But now this is all being done with stone and bone tools. So how does that change end up affecting the economy? And by that change, of course, we're talking about the beginning of metallurgy and the coming of not only bronze tools and copper tools, but also iron tools. So this changes everything in terms of economic output. Because people are spending so much time constantly maintaining and replacing stone tools, which are extremely difficult to create and break very easily, a lot of economic productivity is being spent on maintaining tools, right? And so the beginning of iron and copper and bronze means now not only do your tools not break, but they produce far more, and you don't have to spend as much time constantly maintaining them. And there's a wider specialization of labor as people start to begin mining and start to become smiths themselves and refining these materials. And as we see this change start to happen into social stratification and a division of labor, we start to see more and more complex societies that are more hierarchical. And these more hierarchical societies create specializations and differences between different groups. These differences then equate to much higher economic activity historically. So now we're at a point where Africa's economy has advanced cereal grains, has pastoralism and a number of animals and crops that are domesticated specifically for high-yield agricultural production. We see the beginning of tool making and metallurgy. Now we walk into a very unique period in African history. Most people focus on pharaonic Egypt as sort of the epitome of this, but an interesting source that I found was Walter Rodney, and he focuses instead on Egypt in the 9th century. Source focus. In these source focus sections, we're going to take a dive into our sources themselves and evaluate them a little bit and sort of flesh out what it is they're trying to say. So this source is Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And his focus is on Fatimid Egypt from approximately 969 to 1170. He describes a lot of social phenomenon to do with this state and how it existed, but we're interested in the evolution of the economy, right? And so these social factors do have some small part to play. So for example, in Fatimid Egypt, taxes were incredibly high for regular working people who were basically serfs. They were brutalized when they couldn't make their tax payments, and Rodney sets this up as a sort of antagonistic contradiction between a foreign feudal warrior landlord population and a local serf population. Now, what this means economically is that the realm was very stable. It wasn't being raided very often, and this stability allowed for all sorts of advanced economic activity to start happening. So Rodney really draws this out whenever he talks about the flourishing of science specifically. His examples include like windmills spreading across the land and water wheels becoming more important. A lot of these being introduced from Persia, right? And so some of the amazing industries he brings up is paper milling, sugar refining, porcelain, even the distillation of gasoline were all new industries which were appearing in Egypt at this time. So what this really starts to give us a sense of is that whenever there's an internal stability for a long time in a region, in African history, that polity is able to develop massively. So he ties this stability to these massive developing industries. But we can really see a genesis here, and he really helps underscore our argument that there's a genesis, because the evolution from a simple hunter-gatherer society to a place that's, refining sugar and paper milling and even gasoline makes a huge jump. And so we're really starting to see this pattern of as food sources come together, especially with crops and animal husbandry, now suddenly we're starting to see these explosion of advanced industries. So we really get a picture of Africa's economies moving upwards and upwards and upwards. Now, this isn't a universal thing. Not all of Africa was like this, and Rodney makes that very clear. Africa's economies were very distinct and regionalized, but we can really start to see a high point of where Africa's economy is going in this Egyptian example in between the years 969 to 1170.
In the Caribbean, we were assigned sugar. There was no choice. The Ghanaians had an assignment of cocoa. The International Division of Labor allocated to the Senegal and to Gambia and to the Gambia the role of providing groundnuts, or peanuts as we call it.
So we've walked through this evolution from the very beginning of hunter-gatherer society all the way to the high point of Egypt in the 900s. Where else did this train lead? Where else did this huge amount of development go? So another focus would be West Africa. And West Africa is a very diverse region that housed a number of states that were extremely developed economically. So we could start really with the Ghana Empire. So the Songhai people are considered the founders of the Ghana Empire, who became important middlemen as the basis to their economy in the trans-Saharan trade. Its location in the Sahel between the Niger and Senegal rivers encouraged fishing and agricultural activities. So on top of fishing and agriculture, we've got millet and sorghum, which were cultivated. Ghana was described as this land of gold because of the huge amounts of wealth accumulated by people living there. The land was very fertile, which made food very cheap, and this part's important. Cheap food allowed for the development of many other spheres of the empire. The Ghanan state was really well developed because of this extensive economic base. For example, there was a sophisticated monarchy in Ghana with an imperial cabinet of ministers, including many well-educated Muslim scholars. Literacy was widespread in order to increase state efficiency, which undergirded positions like court interpreters and court treasurers, as well as chief justices, which oversaw a complex justice system. The empire could also afford to have a large and effective military. Soldiers, by their nature, dedicate their time to military pursuits instead of self-perpetuating agricultural work. So it seems unlikely to me that they could have maintained such a sophisticated court and state structure, like when we're talking about chief justices and a complex justice system and court and treasurers and interpreters, without a very productive economy, which freed more hours from the toil of agriculture. So because people weren't as invested in agriculture, didn't have to look after themselves and farm as much as that became more specialized, we've now got a huge flourishing of the economy, which leads to a huge flourishing of society. The state brought in revenues from the rich Ghanaian economy through taxes paid by regional governors. These taxes were often paid in kind with items like salt, gold, ivory, and cola nuts. Another revenue source were tolls paid to the state from the trade routes that wound their way through the kingdom. Now, the Ghanan Empire ends up declining, but is mostly inherited by the Malian Empire, or the Mali Empire. The Mali Empire took over large swaths of the Ghana Empire, including its gold-producing regions. Mining and trading were prevalent. It had a similarly well-developed state apparatus, while also derived its economy from the very productive land and trade routes. So the land was so productive because these cereal grains allowed for huge amounts of production, but also because of the environmental factors of West Africa, especially the high levels of rainfall and the prevalence of a large number of rivers, which meant that agriculture, in a standard farming, sedentary agriculture sense, was super productive. The introduction of Islam led to some large changes in these West African economies, and African economies more generally, honestly. Muslim formal education, like we talked about with these well-educated scholars in the Ghana Empire previously, was particularly adroit at facilitating more complex states because of a scholastic focus on literacy and numeracy. The economy became better managed as its managers increased their specializations through education. Like a parallel to this would be the introduction of writing in Egypt, and how that allowed for greater specialization and economic complexity. This is in the period of Egypt which we studied, but also Pharaonic Egypt, which most people know about as the birthplace of hieroglyphics and things. But this is really that same parallel of economic complexity. The spread of Islam also helped to expand trading relationships between West Africa and the Mediterranean market through the trans-Saharan trade, as well as West Africa being increasingly incorporated into global trading markets through this trade, not only to the Mediterranean, but what markets is the Mediterranean connected to, right? They're connected to Asia, they're connected to especially East Asia, the Silk Road in India. So Timbuktu, for example, is the leading example of a new kind of city in West Africa. Timbuktu was the center of learning and trade, and it focused towards this new phenomenon, Timbuktu, of increasing trade revenues as well as increasing education levels and literacy in the economy. The fact that Muslim scholars were increasingly appointed to administrative positions within West African economies also helps to show that Islam had a part to play in increasing the specialization in the economy, which was tied to education. Simply put, like, if you have somebody that's going through a formal education that is a well-advised, well-educated specialist in their field, whether that be mathematics or something, that person can then apply those skills in a concrete way to being able to advise a ruler or a king. Now this ruler is able to maximize revenues from a certain agency. They're able to efficiently tax a trade route. They're able to avoid corruption whenever gold yields are being reported. And these are all brought in by our sources whenever we're studying this. But without Islam and the advent of Islamic universities, we wouldn't have these centers of learning. So yes, it led to a spreading of religious worship, but fundamentally it taught a lot of practical skills for an economy that's really important, especially because as an economy specializes, it's more able to effectively divide labor. And as labor is more effectively divided, that now means that labor becomes more efficient. Somebody that can focus on farming all day can get really, really good at farming. Their methods can get really good. Their tool usage can get better, etc. The same thing applies to these state administrators. It's very important to understand this because these state administrators were able to change hugely how the state worked, and that had a huge impact on the economy. So there is a definite link between the rise of Islamic schools and this beginning professional class that was able to professionally and scientifically advise the economy, which then increased state revenues, which has a huge part to play in the development of the economy. Near the end of its existence, the Malian Empire began to degrade economically due to political turmoil and internal strife. This goes back to some of the theories of Walter Rodney at the beginning of our podcast, where he was talking about the stability of a polity really enables its economy to become bigger and more dynamic. So in the Malian example, as the stability starts to degrade, the economy really starts to degrade with it. The Malian Empire loses control over large swaths of productive territory, especially their gold mines, and this deepens the economic troubles of the empire. The empire is eventually eclipsed by the Songhai Empire, which, in the same way that the Malians inherited the legacy of the Ghanaian economy, the Songhai inherit the legacy of the Malian economy in West Africa. The Songhai Empire's administration over the West African breadbasket, mining sector, and trade routes ensured that it too had a sophisticated state. It instituted a common system of weights and measurements, which had a stimulating effect on the economy. Furthermore, regulations were introduced by market inspectors who helped to regularize trade within the new framework, and they cracked down on dishonest trade, which was harmful to the economy of the Songhai Empire. These are really dynamic and interesting and innovative economic reforms that haven't really been seen in Africa before, maybe outside of the most advanced cases in Egypt, but this was across the continent. This is an isolated incident. These economic reforms all exist within the backdrop of a newly introduced banking and credit system. This is huge, which allowed for capital concentrations which were not possible previously. The mobilization of Songhai capital contributed to steep advances in economic growth and mark a very notable departure from the strictly feudal economies in West Africa's past. With funds mobilized through the banking system and the economy rationalized with weights and measures, the land was made even more productive through extensive irrigation, well digging, and canal building programs. So not only is the state now expanding in terms of its tax revenues, but it's actually improving the land. The advent of irrigation in West Africa had always sort of existed, but the extent at which the Songhai Empire began this is incredible. And so now the land is becoming more and more productive. The canal building programs were especially important in a land that is connected by trade. And in a time before trucks, where a road network is not very effective, canals are extremely effective and vital arteries of trade. And that just goes to demonstrate how important trade was to this empire. New economies appeared as the economy of Songhai flourished under favorable state guidance, like we described earlier with some of those investment programs of the state. Primary industries such as salt mining, fishing, hunting, and farming brought increasing yields year on year, but crucially secondary industries also became dominant. The metalworking sector exploded, as well as textile-intensive cloth weaving for domestic consumption. Not only for domestic consumption, but for export as well. The rationalization of the economy was mirrored as the state leveraged its educated specialists to further expand its tariff system of taxing trade goods. Similar to other advanced economies of the 16th and 17th centuries, state funds were primarily raised through taxing imports and exports through a system of mercantilism. Modern states, in today's day and age, have instruments like income taxes and property taxes to raise funds, but states at this time instead mobilize taxes through tariffs and trade on goods themselves, right? This helps to underscore why trade was so important for the Songhai and other advanced African economies generally. It was the lifeblood of government revenues. Trade was everything to being able to raise money for the government. Sankore University is another example of an increasing focus on education for the Songhai. Aksa the Great of Songhai was a king who paid the salaries of Muslim scholars in order to continue precipitating this great economic focus on education. I hope I'm kind of getting through here so just how important education was to the administration of this incredibly advanced state. As this education became more ingrained, the state started to be able to do way more things, like I talked about earlier with canal building and well digging, etc. But even this came to an end. Gradually, the Songhai fell because of internal strife. As political stability fell, the specialists who administered and taxed large parts of the economy gradually fell to corruption. Funds which previously flowed into state coffers now suddenly instead fell into private and factionalized hands. This had serious knock-on effects for an economy which relied on state intervention to continue the expanding industry and access to trade markets. As political stability unraveled, the economy entered a negative feedback loop of diminishing returns. And all of this happening, because they were so reliant on the state, all of this happening really was not helped by a period of drought. West Africa often gets falsely understood by especially Western scholars that haven't done enough research into the field as simply like this gold economy and just this place that gold came from. This is based off of some misconceptions from early Muslim and European scholars of West Africa. But the basis to the economy here was not gold, it was agriculture, very rich agricultural land. And the period of drought strained the agricultural economic base of the Songhai Empire. This was still a feudal economy. It was still in the pre-industrial era. So the bedrock of economic activity was still very much the simple smallholder farmer. The droughts near the end of the Songhai period resulted in disrupted economic activity as well as susceptibility to famine and plague. Moreover, as the Songhai economy through warfare and rebellion lost access to mineral-rich areas responsible for gold and salt revenues, as well as the trade routes that service those industries, trade revenues fell even further still. And as the great economy faltered, as the military and political apparatuses, which were contingent on the economy we've described, shattered, the decline of the empire was inevitable. So we've laid out a lot here. So let's do some analysis of what we've talked about. The thing that makes the economies of West Africa special in this period is that the backbone of the economy, the simple smallholder farmer, could produce dramatically higher yields than other regions in Africa, other economies in Africa. Like, originally this was due to factors of climate and terrain, but over time the advanced states in the region began intensively developing the land in order to increase productivity even further. This was greatly aided by the introduction of foreign crops, which produce huge amounts of food compared to domestic crops. In the same way that barley and millet were hugely innovative in the Paleolithic period and the beginning of agriculture, maize or corn was a great example of this change happening in West Africa. This crop was originally from the New World, and whenever it was introduced, badlands or marginal farmland in West Africa, which was not suitable to cultivation by wheat, barley, and millet, could be brought under production with corn crops. It starts to become clear that the already existing economic advantages of the region were greatly enhanced by West Africans themselves, leading to booming economies and represent a drastic evolution in Africa's economic genesis. And to harp on this point again, this is a huge evolution. As we start to see state intervention in the economy and massive development of already rich areas into even richer and even richer and even richer areas that are blessed with amazing economic resources like gold and salt and copper, that have excellent connections to world markets through the Sahara trade, like, we're really looking at a high-end economy here, one that's fundamentally understudied and underappreciated by most scholars, I would argue, but this picture really paints this crescendo that I'm talking about, and this evolution towards, this great economic high, and the societies which were able to come out of this were fantastic. So let's keep studying West Africa. This is an interesting period. So let's go into another example of some of our sources that we're using for this. Source focus. An interesting article we can pull on here is by Candice Goucher, Charles LeGuin, Linda Watson. It's called Trade, Transport, Temples and Tribute, the Economics of Power. And it focuses specifically on these different West African empires. The source outlines the extravagant wealth of the West African states like Mali, Ghana, and the Songhai empires, and details their rise as to become leaders in production and trade. There's a focus on detailing how the production sector of the Mali economy worked. They get into the details of like how gold production and salt production and copper production worked, but not only how they worked, but how they allowed for huge profits, and then the monopolizations of those profits by the state. So the state used the profits from those industries to build a very stable empire with a powerful military, and that powerful military conquered more land, which meant more minerals, which meant more extraction, etc. They go over the agricultural sector and how it was improved and all the irrigation projects. These concentrated industries provide a basis to a vibrant economy and represents one of the most highly developed economies in African history up until 1800. Now, the source demonstrates that the productive patterns of the Malian economy led to huge increases in specifically urbanization and education. These aren't just economic factors, right? These are sort of knock-on effects of that. The proliferation of cheap food, cheap primary industry resources, and extensive foreign demand through the Saharan trade routes lead to a booming productive sector in the Malian Empire and West Africa more generally. The knock-on effects like education and urbanization are argued in this piece to be engaged in a dialectic with the economy. So as the economy gets stronger and stronger, we start to see the emergence of this education and urbanization phenomenon going on. And their emergence has a feedback loop that then strengthens the economy further. And then that strengthened further economy now provides more administrators and more state agents who could use the literacy and numeracy that they have to advise the administration to build successful and efficient states, right? That feeds back into needing more administrators, needing more education, needing more urbanization. And this is a positive feedback loop that's created between these two cycles. And they really feed off of each other and help to create an advanced economy. The trouble is that they're contingent on stability. And to bring in Rodney from earlier on, why didn't this just continue existing ad nauseum until the end of time? And the answer is that Rodney would say because the political stability of this polity was destroyed. So to criticize the source a little bit, this is a correct observation of how this works. But understanding some of the deficits here and how this whole thing can fall apart actually deepens our understanding of what we're trying to argue, which is that these things can really inform each other and help make an economy very strong. And seeing the beginnings of an education system and urbanization really starts to give us a look under the hood as to what's happening economically. So we've laid out so far in a pretty well-organized way the beginnings of the economy into its sort of first crescendo in Egypt, moving into West Africa and all the fascinating and interesting things that have happened there, with all of our source focuses along the way diving into these sources. So we'll be a little more brief in the interest of time. We'll move into Kenem Bornu. And Kenem Bornu in West Africa, in the analysis of this podcast, are sort of the high point crescendo that we were talking about in this evolution. The argument is fundamentally that the economy improved and improved and improved, reached a crescendo, and then began to decline. So if the crescendo wasn't West Africa, then it's definitely Kenem Bornu, or Kenem Bornu. They're interchangeably used. So this civilization developed around Lake Chad and had access to very fertile and irrigated farmland, as well as fishing and hunting. They traded extensively with the rest of the Muslim world through the Trans-Saharan route. They exported cotton, slaves, hides, and skins, while importing cowries, beads, camels, salt, textiles, and material goods. The state that existed in Kenem Bornu was very stable because of a good governance structure, which included extensive regionalization. This was divided into 4 sections, the state was. These quartets, or sections of 4, were very stable, and the good governance structure was because of this regionalization. Now, the stability is a recurring theme you might recognize here, ends up being really important because that provides a basis for this economy to be fostered, right? So, let's take an example. Mai Dunama II, from 1221 to 1259, was an economy-focused king who focused on the expansion of trade contacts between the kingdom and North Africa, as well as the Sudan. Now, here we're going to hit another recurring theme again, right? Muslim scholars had a similar effect on Kenem Bornu as they did in our earlier discussion of Songhai and Mali in West Africa. Their education and literacy led to increased state efficiency and rationalization of some sectors of the economy that they oversaw. The formation of Islamic learning centers also helped to perpetuate this tradition of formally educated men joining the clergy and secular administration, as well as providing crucial literacy boosts to the economy as it developed. We see again through the Kenem Bornu example that the inroads made by Muslim clerics into the administration helped to reinforce trade links with the wider Muslim world, strengthening the economy and providing export markets for exotic goods from the area under the sway of the Mai. This is the term for king in the empire. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the empire's economy began its downward spiral. A spate of civil wars and state instability led to disturbances in the trade routes, which damaged food security in a region which had become dependent on food exports. Although it was an agriculturally rich area based around Lake Chad was only so big, and as the population grew and grew, they became dependent on food imports, and eventually once the access to those routes was disturbed, everything sort of fell apart. The faltering economy, which was now racked by famine and starvation, ensured that the government eventually fell to its neighbors. So we have an interesting source here that's on the history of West Africa with Kenem Bornu, but I think it's time for a source focus. So an interesting source to look into for our Kenem Bornu information is called History of West Africa, Volume 2, edited by J.F.A, Ajayi, and Michael Crowder from 1973. Now, the author goes through sort of the things that we've mentioned as to this great evolving economy, the economic basis to it in the agricultural sector, the trade sector, the ongoing food reliance on external food imports. So we start to really see through this author's example that things are growing up until about the mid to late point of the Kenem Bornu Empire, and then things start to decline. And this is really important because this is what I would identify as the crescendo. So the formative point where African economies grew and grew and grew till this golden age. And then after this, things really start to fall apart. And I could pick any number of empires to say this was the crescendo, but I think Kenem Bornu fits it well, as this author will explain. He's interested in explaining the conflicts which caused the descent. And fundamentally, this is a political history, so I have to try to make an economic history out of that. But there are indicators here that we can find, right? So he's interested in describing the conflicts which caused the downfall of Kanem Borno. The author describes that the political instability which secured the economy was cut to ribbons after the death of Mai Idris Aluma. The previously hyper-centralized state disintegrated into its constituent parts, with only the most formal and non-committal relationships remaining between the center and the periphery of the empire. This is especially relevant in the context of the 4 quadrants that we talked about. These were like the 4 provinces that were under control of the Mai. These remaining ties, which were these non-committal relationships we're talking about that are being cut to ribbons, these remaining ties were often seen as fetters by those who wanted to resist central authority, particularly the Fulani people. The Fulani came under the leadership of religious fundamentalists like Umar ibn Adur and launched several rebellions against the crown. These rebellions helped to weaken the central government, which eventually led to one of its vassals in the personage of Al-Kanemi. This guy's really important. Now, his rebellion was made possible because of the economic tax structure of the Kanem Borno state, which was separated into these quarters. Because so much power was held in so few hands, like just 4 people and the king, it allowed Al-Kanemi's rebel faction to mobilize enough resources during a time of crisis to be a threat to centralized power. He was in charge of one of those 4 quartets. He was one of the vassals. So because there were only 4 or 5 people at the table of power, one of those people falling and becoming an enemy of the state meant that a huge amount of the economy was mobilized, as opposed to a smaller system which might have, one vassal in control of 5% of the power or something. I promise this has to do with economics. We'll get there. So him being mobilized was a real threat to centralized power. In this way, the economic structure of the rich empire became its undoing because of the concentrated way it was mobilized at the state level. Like, what I'm really trying to argue here is that because this thing was so centralized, that led to its rise, but that also led to its downfall. Because it was so centralized, that was sort of what enabled this rebel under Al-Kanemi to be able to undermine the empire itself. So the author lays all this out, right? But his focus on political issues is thorough and mostly correct. But the sources which remain to us from this period are from the latter second founding of the Kanem Borno state in the 19th century. It has to do with the fall, and we don't have anything from the first period that really has to do with the rise of this empire. Those sources simply don't come down to us. Although much of the economic basis to the state remained the same in both the time of the 12 to 1300s in the first period and the time of the 1800s in the second period, the sources from the second state regard the original state in the medieval period as weak and disorganized. And this is primarily, we think, to prop up their own legitimacy. Like, of course, they would call the earlier people weak and unorganized. This makes the text very useful in conveying events from the second state period, but biases our views towards the first state period in ways in which we should consider when studying its history. Kanem Borno represents both the rise and then the fall of these African economies. So, to do some analysis after our source breakdown here, this shows the evolution of Africa as it grows towards a crescendo. It grows in complexity. We can see this through the irrigation structures that we've been talking about. We can talk about the advanced state structures, which allowed for the security of the economy, especially in the Kanem Borno example. The state's really important here. And it grows and grows in complexity up until this point. But then they start falling, right? And this didn't happen in a vacuum. There's a reason why these empires suddenly start falling. Why did these economies fall apart? What happened to these production sectors? If anything, the introduction of new crops should mean that they're expanding now. Like corn and maize are here. Why are things degrading, right? And there's a really good answer to that we'll get to in our next section. The reason why these African economies that we've studied and Africa's economies more generally began to decline was fundamentally because of the introduction of Europeans into the African equation. So the trans-Saharan trade route dried up in the 18th century with the discovery of the European sea route and European competition, which could offer cheaper goods and more kinds of goods, things they couldn't really get as often, like silk, spices, and guns. Commodities like sugar, coming from sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton required huge amounts of labor in order to grow. This was part of the incentive for Europeans to begin purchasing large number of slaves for their New World plantations. The majority of African captives were from present-day Senegal, Angola, Benin, Nigeria, and Cameroon. So the slave trade comes after the introduction of European goods. European goods begin to depress local prices because Europeans made these things en masse at the time for lower prices than were available domestically. This destroyed huge numbers of industries. The guild system that we talked about from gold mining and smithing and ironworking in the Songhai Empire was outcompeted by cheap European goods. And a lot of these people that were in secondary metal production were thrown out into the streets without jobs simply because of that competition. So not only were the local economies suppressed because of competition with European markets and European goods, but now there was a trade imbalance which was largely offset by slavery. And so the onset of slavery really starts to eat away at Africa's various economies. And so let's dive into that and explore why. The slave trade often involved Africans selling fellow Africans in its mechanics, although Europeans were responsible for this ultimately. African kings sold prisoners of war to enrich themselves and their territories economically and achieve better relations with European traders who now dominated the African trade. The massive demand for slaves led African slave dealers to resort to unscrupulous means of attaining slaves, such as kidnapping or even instigating wars so that they could get prisoners in the process. And this all feeds into the triangle trade. So the triangle trade began in Europe, where manufactured goods like firearms, brass, and textiles were shipped to West Africa in exchange for slaves. Those slaves would be transported to the New World in exchange for colonial goods like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. These goods were sold in Europe, and then the cycle would begin again in this odious cycle between these three different poles of Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. This had a huge effect on African economies, who were massively distorted by this. The slave trade led to a large population decline, but crucially, the people who were sold into slavery were often young and fit people. This meant that dependents, or the elderly or the sick, remained behind, uncaptured, as a burden to their communities, but there's a decreasing number of people left in the community to actually do productive work to support them. This sometimes led to demographic collapse and overall acted as a huge malus on African economies. Furthermore, the provision of cheap and industrial-produced European goods destroyed local markets, just like we talked about, because local markets were often artisan-produced, and as the advent of industrialism began in Europe, they simply could not compete. So these are really two prongs between slavery and the introduction of European goods really start to hurt African economies, and they start to decline. Every economy we've looked at, the Egyptian economy, the West African economies, kind of in Bornu, like these are all basically undergirded, or rather undermined, and eventually effectively destroyed by these factors. If we were to look at East Africa for a moment in the Indian Ocean trade, this had existed for a long time, back to 700, and there was slavery that existed through the Indian Ocean trade. People were traded for items like wood, ivory, gold, hides, skins, cotton, silk, rice, spices, military equipment, coffee, etc. And state economies filled their treasuries with tariffs and import duties derived from the huge volumes of trade that were derived from slavery, but also in East Africa before the coming of the Europeans, there were large amounts of legitimate trade going through these ports. These ports birthed huge and important, vibrant cities like Mogadishu, Zanzibar, and Cancun. The Indian Ocean trade was so massive in scale that it often pulled entire economies into its orbit. Many people switched their professions from productive primary industry jobs to becoming traders and merchants because of the huge profits that could be made. And this negatively impacted the economic development of some African economies as their productive bases languished at the expense of the trading sector. Trade and commerce became so important that industry was oftentimes left behind. Now this basis really starts to heat up as slavery kicks off, because there is already a huge incentive for there to be trade above industrial production. And as slaves become a very important commodity, those slaves gradually entirely surpass most of what was considered legitimate trade. So if we were to look at one of the states really affected by slavery here, we can look at the Kingdom of Benin. And Benin is the most notorious for being, effectively destroyed as a polity by Europeans and slavers. Slave wars became common as they dominated the 17th century political scene in Benin, leading to massive depopulation and economic ruin for the area. And the examples that we can pull from our texts are that, these wars were started to be able to achieve access to a source of slaves, which would then mean that they could achieve access to European goods, which was now the only way to attain a large number of goods because local production had been wiped out. So we really start to see the negative feedback loop here, and it starts to fit the analysis of a real decline in economic activity. A lot of these states went from being prosperous and centralized productive areas, in the case of Benin especially, which was in the neighborhood of these West African states, except coastal, like not that far to the south. Now suddenly the polity's been destroyed by slave wars, right? So clearly something happened here. Now let's get into analysis of one of our sources on slavery. Source focus. So an interesting source that describes a lot of this economic change is called The Impact of the Slave Trade on African Economies by Warren Whatley and Rob Gillezeau from 2009. They describe the serious economic consequences of slavery. The most obvious one, which people have focused on so far, has been the statistical depopulation of African states, especially the most productive and fit members of society, as we described. But this paper does something interesting, and it looks at the economic consequences of some of the social damage of slavery. It talks about how during the process of enslavement, when someone's captured, they're put not to death literally, but are put to social death. They're left to owe the remainder of their life to some person that spared them. And it discusses that slavery is poisonous to economic growth domestically. It incentivizes elites to produce to pursue slave raiding as their path to wealth and grandeur at the expense of building powerful states and improving the existing revenues by developing the land. The authors don't ignore the often focused demographic damage that slavery did, though. This is focused on a lot, but the authors acknowledge this. They estimate that 9.3% of the total population of Africa per generation was sold into slavery during the period of 1701 to 1850, which is, incredible, the scale of this damage. The paper concludes that African resources prior to the period of slavery were largely mobilized for the creation of greater and more complex states, as well as higher levels of production and trade. But from the advent of slavery onwards, slavery acted as a competitor to those resources being put towards production. Slavery effectively diverted huge swathes of African economic activity into parasitic and ultimately self-defeating economic practice. This helped to weaken African economies by enmeshing them in European-dominated trade relationships and relegated African economies to dependent export economies, while simultaneously reducing legitimate trade year on year by incentivizing the self-defeating economic activity of slavery. So this paper is super insightful, it's well-researched, and it provides a fascinating economic overview of precisely the relationship between the African economies and slavery. To be critical of this source leaves remarkably little to criticize, unlike some of our other ones that we've examined in these source focuses, which is a testament to the paper's veracity. It considers the opposing views to its opinions, so including claims by David Eltis that the slave trade was not a dominant form of economic activity, and John Farge's claim that the slave trade favored political consolidation of African states, which I find dubious from the research I've done for this. But the author regards these as fundamentally empirical questions, which are disproven by the data and broader economic model forwarded in this excellent paper. So the authors are basically saying, yeah, this is a question of facts that we can measure. The facts that we're presenting are simply disproving these criticisms, which is fascinating. So in an attempt to be critical of this paper, I find myself agreeing with these folks in what they're doing. And so this really shows, again, this evolution aspect of Africa climbing to this crescendo, but now we're really in a downfall. We're describing the demographic destruction of these economies, we're describing the industrial destruction of these economies, and we're describing the processes of slavery and economic competition that really led them there. And understanding precisely how these processes worked helps us to actually understand what happened and how things could have went from so prominent and so growth focused to so focused on being an export economy and colonization and slavery so quickly. The answer to these points being, of course, that these things started to devolve because of slavery, because of European economic introductions of goods, and because of the suppression of local industry that came from that. That's what led to this devolution from the evolution before. So being mindful of your time, we're going to do a quick analysis of the Zulu, and then we're going to conclude the podcast. The Zulu are really important to bring up here because they represent a further downward spiral and give us some examples of these processes which we've talked about with slavery and European industrial goods. So let's look at the Zulu kingdom real quick. The Zulu kingdom was made up of Nguni people who were mainly herders. They're pastoralists. Their numbers before the year 1800 probably hovered around 1,500 people. Their pastoralism was aided by small amounts of domestic agriculture, which honestly can be better described as like gardening near their homes. In the early 1800s, the Zulu people began to experience drought. This made their pastoralism more and more difficult as pasture land became more rare and more of that land was lost to desertification. They had extensive trade tied up with contacts with European traders. So exports included ivory, cattle, and slaves. Imports were copper, brass, textiles, and beads. This is all during the reign of Shaka Zulu, for example. Studying the Zulu is important because we need to look at what economies could exist and what growth there was, and the Zulu are a good example of that. The Zulu went through a period of desertification, by which they could no longer feed their animals, they could no longer continue much of their gardening, because huge amounts of their pasture land were being brought into desert. So the agricultural crisis of the Zulu kingdom in large part spurred the development within the Zulu kingdom of a hyper-militant political focus. The Zulu kingdom's status quo was impossible to maintain because of these environmental changes, because of this desertification. They couldn't feed their animals anymore. This shattered the economy and made demographic collapse inevitable unless there was some kind of huge change, and that hyper-militant political focus was that change. Shaka Zulu, informed by these environmental changes, proposed a path of conquest in order to secure the livelihood of the Zulu people. This shows how connected the economic spheres and the political military spheres are. So to be able to analyze some of this and more of the particularities, let's do a quick source focus. Our final source focus is going to be an article called Ecological Change and Pre-Shakan State Formation by James Gump. Now, we're going to look at this and the Zulu more generally because these were the economies that did exist, that did thrive, that did expand. We've seen the contraction of the more traditional economies in Africa, but these non-traditional pastoral economies, as exemplified by the Zulu, become really quite dominant and really quite important. I would argue that these things happen specifically because slavery destroys the old ways, because these European goods destroy the old ways. African economies provide for different kinds of states now that are able to do different kinds of things, existing in an environment of pressure to do with the presence of slavery and European competition for goods. So let's get into the Zulu and exactly what they were. So this paper investigates what led to the ecological changes which were so crucial to the Zulu economy's conversion from a pastoral economy to a strictly war economy. It notes that Zulu land in the 1400s was a verdant region full of forests and meadows, which were very productive to the pastoralist Zulu. By the end of the Zulu, they can now mobilize an empire of 500,000 men out of this previously very verdant land. So you would think that this is from farming, but it's not. It's actually because of crisis. This ecology was the bedrock to their economy. The topsoil was rather thin, which meant that Zulu land could not maintain the sedentary and cereal-centric agriculture which undergirded the economic strength of other regions of Africa. Adapting to the environment, Zulu agriculturalists utilized pastoralism in order to earn a living from the land. Again, like we talked about with Rodney, this is sort of living from the land being the economy. Long-term overgrazing eventually led to the destruction of productive grazing grasses and their replacement with less useful species, that is, in wetter areas. In wetter areas, the grazing grasses are being replaced by things that aren't very useful. You can't really feed to animals, but in drier areas, these useful grasses were not being replaced at all. And this starts a negative feedback loop where the decreasing quantity of grasses meant that the topsoil was more vulnerable to runoff from rainfall. This further damages the grasses. This is incredibly important economically because as an agricultural pastoralist society, the environmental collapse of the useful green grasses resulted in like an implosion of the Zulu economy. Now, this paper is very useful because its ecological focus and very well-researched knowledge of Zululand's environment and geographical particularities. But its introduction, it simply assumes that Zululand's environmental degradation was solely because of human activities, as if it was only humans and their grazing that led to the destruction of the economy. Other scholarship by Charles Ballard labels this change as being fundamentally because of climate change and not solely human activity. So there's a conflict there. The accusation that the Zulu effectively destroyed their own ecology and therefore their own economy is just unfounded. However, Gump's paper is still useful as to the mechanics that led to the economic collapse. So that's the basis to the Zulu economy. Now, this economy goes to war and wraps in all of the other economies that it then conquers because it can no longer sustain itself. Because of an economic crisis, it had to expand and it had to conquer a huge empire, which is, world-renowned. But understanding the basis to that being an ecological crisis is very important. So a hyper-militaristic, incredibly expansionist, and incorporating pluralistic empire is what the Zulu become. That's the kind of state that can exist now in this period. By the time of 1800, by the end of the course is a defined period that we're going to look at. That's all that exists now. So it really goes to show as to how bad things have gotten. Now, African economies still exist. By exist, I mean prevalent. Like the Malian economy is effectively destroyed. The West African economy is in tatters. Benin has destroyed itself in a slave war. Most of Africa's various economies are now massively suppressed. And the success stories that we do see, like in this new innovative Zulu model, are hyper-militaristic, and that model eventually falls, although that's outside the scope of this course. So we're now at the bottom, and we can really see how far down exactly things have fallen economically for Africa. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of African Economic History. To go through a quick conclusion here, we see the rise of Africa and its evolution through the hunter-gatherer stage, its expansion throughout Africa, the advent of tools and very important agricultural innovations. These things begin to crescendo in Egypt and in West Africa and in Kenya and Bornu. And then as we reach this crescendo of extreme innovation and economic activity, everything starts to take a downfall, and the advent of European trade and slavery begins to seriously degrade the African economy in the doom loops and the negative feedback loops that we described. And this ends with the sorts of economies that are able to thrive at this time and expand are entirely new, very innovative conquest economies like we see in Zululand. And Zululand's eventual rise and fall are fundamentally due to ecological factors in the rise, and then because of imperial political factors due to the British Empire in the fall. So yeah, that is my podcast. Fundamentally, Africa's economy is fascinating, and the evolution here is amazing from the most humble beginnings to this crescendo and then to the fall. Now what we're seeing again is that rise, right? Like I described at the beginning of the podcast, in Kenya and Nigeria, we're seeing huge economic growth numbers, and Africa has been there before, and Africa has done this before. So I hope that my analysis was worthwhile. I apologize for the length of the podcast and its lateness. I hope you have a good night. Thank you very much.